I'm going to change the accelerator rod from a Series 1 to a Series 2. I'm taking the split pin out to release the accelerator cable. Then 4 bolts to remove the mount. Then pushing out the accelerator rod bush and then manipulating it out of the actual cavity. So this is what a bush can look like. This one's a hard plastic type. They tend to go brittle and break apart. This one is a 3D printed one, which I did earlier. Now to disconnect the accelerator cable and then remove the modifications I made earlier. And then pulling back the accelerator cable. I'm disconnecting the handbrake to give myself more room to work with. This is a Series 1 accelerator rod. You'll notice at the end has a lug on there with a hole, and you just fit the accelerator cable over the end with a split pin and washer. So this is a Series 1. You'll notice that the spring is in the engine bay and it takes the tension out of the cable when you push the accelerator all the way to the floor. It's designed to stop you putting too much tension on the wire. So this is from a Series 2. You'll notice it has a completely different endpoint here and a rod which goes through connected to the accelerator cable. The spring goes on the end here instead. There's a clip here that has to be undone to take out the accelerator cable. I'm now just pulling back the accelerator cable and just moving the center console out of the way so I can get better access. The accelerator cable runs through a steel tube which goes through the center of the car. I'm pulling back the cable from the engine bay because I'm going to use that to feed the new cable through. I'm feeding through the new Series 2 cable from the cavity and then pulling it back through. I'm attaching one end of the wire to the rod and I'm just going to pull it through here with the old cable. I couldn't get the rod at the end of the accelerator cable to go through the tube because the tube has a bit of a kink in it. It looks like it's factory done, it's just not designed for this kind of accelerator cable. And there's another problem where the end won't fit inside the tube. So it looks like about 2mm between the Series 2 and the Series 1 accelerator cable. I'm removing the plate so I can get better access to look inside the tunnel. I want to see if something weird's going on there or I can do something else about this. The Series 2 accelerator cable just won't fit inside the Series 1 tube. I'm cutting off the engine side of the accelerator cable so I can crimp a new one on later. I need to do this in order to feed through the rod as well as change the mounting point. I need to reuse the mount point that came from the Series 1 cable, so I'm just pulling off the sheaths. So the inner sheath of the Series 1 is about 1mm smaller than the Series 2. That inner sheath also fits in here perfectly, so I'm going to have to drill it out for the Series 2 cable. Luckily the outer sheath seems to be a similar size, so I can just squeeze it in with a bit of effort. I'm lining up the outer sheath here and you can see that the cable is actually shorter, so I'm going to need to cut that as well. I fed the accelerator cable through and you can see it fits now in the tube. And now cutting the outer sheath to the right length. I painted the accelerator rod and just putting it back into the car and just making sure everything's going to fit. The original accelerator mount's the same in all series, so just putting it back on, 4 bolts, a washer and a split pin. I'm pulling the cable from the engine bay to demonstrate what the spring looks like. This is the adjuster that I cut off the old accelerator cable. I'm just screwing it into the ball socket here. Once I get the new one, I'll be able to crimp it onto the end of the wire. I want to take a closer look at the gearbox and see what's going on. So first comes off the spring, then the slave cylinder, and then the speedometer cable. Off comes the wheel and then disconnecting the reverse light switch. Now taking off the earth strap. And then removing the oil from the gearbox. Unstaking and undoing the nut. Disconnecting the sway bars. Taking off the calipers. And then the nut and bolts that hold on the control arms. Off come the nuts from the top of the struts. Now to wiggle out the entire assembly. I'm doing it this way because I just had the car wheel alignments done and I don't want to have to go through that all over again. By doing it this way I can keep everything preserved. And disconnecting the lollipop because I don't want to do any damage. Undoing the 3 bolts that hold on the starter motor and getting it out of the way. And now on the bell housing, undoing the bottom bolt and the top nut. And 2 other bolts located at the top. Then the lower engine mount. undoing the nut on the driver's side and just making sure the shaft is loose. So I'm knocking out the inner stub axle. The CV joint connects back to the stub axle with these Allen key bolts. You can undo the Allen bolts, but I've just knocked it out instead with a hammer on the back here and just punched it out like this. The stub axle clip is cheap to replace if need be, but it's not the main reason I did it this way. In the service manual, it recommends discarding the old bolts and replacing them with new ones, so knocking out the stub was a good option. Now that I had everything disconnected, I could wiggle out the gearbox and then lift the car. I'm checking over the flywheel and the pressure plate, and they're definitely the correct ones. So this one's the box from the car. I'm going to swap the lever, the fork and the throwout bearing between the two boxes and see what makes a difference. This is the box I took out of the car. You can see the lever comes back to about this point here. Comparing this to the lever on the other box, it goes a lot further back. Undoing the bolt and that looks okay. But the lever needed some lubrication to get it out. I'm just checking the bush and that looks okay, it's not cracked or anything like that, and the bottom here also looks okay and not worn out. So now that I swapped the levers around, I can see it goes a lot further back. The lever on the right is from the car and the one on the left is a spare. Looking at the angle of the bolt, they're very different. The one on the right is from the car. The weld at the top of the lever looks very different from the spare one. Now with the bolt removed, I can see the hole is at slightly different angles. So I replaced the lever, put on some spring clips and then torqued up the bolt. Lifting the gearbox into place and then positioning and wiggling to get it in the right spot. I'm checking over to make sure everything looks in place and everything looks lined up. I'm just now going to tap in the stub axle. So the stub now looks like it's popped back in place. And now tightening up the bell housing and the lower mount. Unfortunately the bolt at the bottom is loose, so I'm going to have to get that helicoiled or come up with some other option. And now reattaching the slave cylinder. And with the press of the clutch, it looks like the problem is now fixed. Refilling the oil till it comes out the top. So now to just clean off any excess oil, I'm going to keep an eye on any oil coming out the seals here. So 12 hours later, I don't see any oil and I don't see any on the floor. And now to start torquing everything back up. I do quite a number of cross references when it comes to the torque settings to make sure I got it right. Putting the starter motor back on, then the earth strap, the reverse switch, then lifting the suspension back into place. Relubricating and then getting the control arm back into position. I have noticed with the groove discs that if this spring is not flat here and not fitting properly in place, you'll get a tick 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 sound as it moves. And now putting the caliper back into position. Reattaching the sway bars. Putting the wheels back on, resting the car on the ground and then torquing up the nuts. Reattaching the speedo cable by screwing it back on. And then finally that spring again. Reattaching the clip that connects the accelerator cable to the tube. Now putting back the plate that covers the tunnel and putting the speedo cable in place. The boot over the selector rod and then the clamp. And then to reattach the transmission link, sometimes known as a lollipop. Then around 1981-1982 they changed it to this type. There's a reference in the manual that talks about fuel injected cars having this type of linkage. Reattaching the gear stick support and the handbrake. Tightening up the handbrake cable and then torquing the nut. But next time, I adjust the door, I pick a cap and screw on this vent.